Welcome to SDP Talks. Our guest today is author, academic, and director of the KEO think tank, Dr. Joanna Williams. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, you've been a very important critic of the lockdown and some of the draconian measures taken that are associated with it. So I thought what we'd do is take a chronological look at government policy from the start and just go through it and see what we think. So first question, what was your reaction to the original lockdown in March?
So in a way it was split. I mean, I was very critical of things like schools closing. You could see which way the wind was going, and in the couple of weeks leading up to lockdown, lots of teachers seemed to be taking to Twitter, and there seemed to be growing momentum behind a campaign to get schools closed. And I actually wrote against schools closing before they even did, before lockdown started. So that was my general view. But having said that, I guess I could see also some rationale towards it. If we put ourselves back in time to what it was like in March, we did have daily press briefings giving us the death statistics. We had news reports showing what was coming out of Italy and Spain. And the situation did look quite grim. So although I was instinctively against lockdown and certainly against schools closing, at the same time, I could see some rationale as to why this was happening. And I guess that did frame certainly my own personal behaviour.
Yeah, I think we were in a very similar position, actually. I think we deliberately didn't, as a party, did not criticise the government's action in March and April. Although I think partly because, sort of to paraphrase more on free will, could you have done otherwise? Could they have done otherwise? And I actually don't think any government facing the situation that it faced could have done otherwise. I mean, in particular, a government where it's two committees, NERV-TAG and SAGE, both said lockdown with the figures that Ferguson produced. I actually don't think they could have done any different.
I think we have to also remember what the motivation was for that initial lockdown. So we were told it would be time limited. We were told 3 weeks. And we were given a very specific motivation that we had to be careful that the NHS didn't become overwhelmed and was unable to cope with the number of people going into hospital. And again, that time limitedness, I think, gave us a bit of steel, if you like, in preparation for lockdown. You grit your teeth and you think, we can do this for 3 weeks. It makes sense to not want to overwhelm the NHS. And it seemed, even if we had personal objections to it on the level of society, it seemed like a fairly rational response to buckle down and do this for 3 weeks. And of course, as we know, it then didn't become just 3 weeks.
7 weeks, yeah. And that was curious. I mean, I was very concerned, as I say, partly out of sort of national unity. And there was a great deal of national unity early on, wasn't there? I deliberately didn't criticise the government, but I did write a piece for SDP Talk, which was, between the lines, anyone reading that piece would see that I was fairly sceptical. And I was sceptical about one thing in particular. I think the government didn't attempt to measure or quantify the costs of the lockdown, the human costs. I wasn't just talking about financial costs, which are considerable and are running into several hundreds of billions now, which also have a human cost, but I actually doubted whether the lockdown would save a single life, actually, really, in net terms. So I put that piece out, and that was the start of our lockdown skepticism as a party, I think.
You see, around the same time then, probably maybe about 3 weeks into lockdown, into the first lockdown, I wrote a piece for the Telegraph, which really argued the case for schools reopening fully to all children as soon as possible. It certainly seemed to me even at that stage, a very draconian measure and a very out of proportion measure. Even the early data was telling us that children were this virus had very little impact upon children. And the atmosphere at that time, at the end of March, was so incredibly polarized and hostile to anyone who dared to question this. It really took me aback, and I'm no novice to controversy in these areas, let's say. So we'd come out of 4 years of very bitter and hostile Brexit debate, where for me at the time of the referendum, I was in academia, and to argue a pro-leave position really held you up to an awful lot of hostility. And yet to argue against lockdown in those early stages, that was a complete whole different order of moral outrage that would be unleashed against you. It really took me by surprise. And anybody who questioned it, the immediate conclusion seemed, or the accusation thrown against you was basically that you wanted to kill all old people, that you didn't care at all for human life, that you were quite happy to unleash some kind of terrible survival of the fittest philosophy, which couldn't be further from my view. But that was the very bitter environment at the time.
It was a strange environment. Actually, the number of skeptics that were prepared to speak out publicly was very small indeed. We interviewed Peter Hitchens, but actually a couple of months ago, but I kept off lockdown because he was so well published on that. But speaking to him privately, I put the point to him that the government couldn't have done anything else because of the two committees. And he said, well, of course, it depends who was on the committee, which I thought was a brilliant point. I mean, actually, to be fair, if Gupta and Hennigan and a few others, Bhopal and others from other universities formed the committee, then perhaps the policy would have been different. Let's talk about the schools, because you've concentrated on that, and I've read your pieces on spikes and other places about it. And I think it's really interesting. We seem to have not taken a humane or protective response to our children here. And like in so many other ways, we burden children now. That's what we do. We don't shield them and protect them and give them sort of guardrails. What we do is we subject them to the full force of whatever's happening. And we've done it again on this. And I think you were bang on. The schools should never have been closed. What we should have done, possibly, is kept them open and taken a more sort of protective attitude. Do you think that's obviously right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like the way you put it in terms of our children. I think that's really important. Obviously, I had a particular interest in my own child, but I really see schooling as being the institution where we enact an intergenerational responsibility to children in the collective. We have a responsibility to educate children, to look after children, and to help children survive in society and bring children into the adult world in a controlled and carefully managed way. And I think the way schools closed en masse was, to me, it was just a real abdication of that responsibility. It was almost as if collectively adults were washing their hands of children, and for the first time really pushing all responsibility for children onto individual parents and families. And again, this is not written down or formally stated, but to me as a parent, when you have children, it feels as if you're entering almost into a social contract. So I have 3 children, and I had each of those children being aware that I was bringing them up into a world where there were nurseries and schools and breakfast clubs and after school clubs and friends and neighbours and extended family members. I never had children thinking these children will be the sole responsibility of myself and my husband. And it just seemed as if that contract, if you like, that social contract with which we care for the next generation collectively, completely went out of the window.
Yeah, I don't think, as I say, I think you're right about that. And I think what we've forgotten is the protective role. I think if you look at everyone was talking about the Swedish model, but the Swedes realized from the start that you can't actually close schools without that affecting the whole of the rest of society, because parents go to work and there are single parents and so on that will be affected by this. So they've their approach seems to be very, very communitarian, very protective. Try and keep calm and carry on. You know, you haven't got children in masks. I mean, what's been interesting here is that there's been no political opposition to any of these things that the government's done, and I want to talk to you a bit later about that. But we've relied on community groups like, you know, Us for Them, for instance, and their petition, which again I support. I think broadly they're bang on. You know, we haven't been protective enough, but it shouldn't really fall to community groups, should it? Really?
No, it shouldn't. And I think it's even worse than you say, because not only have we not been protective towards children, it seems that towards children and young people more broadly, worse than not being protective, it's almost as if we've been happy, or when I say we, I mean particular government ministers especially, have been happy to blame young people and put the burden on young people as if they are somehow the cause of what's gone on. So the particular message to older teenagers of "don't kill your granny," I think is really morally reprehensible, because it suggests that young people put behaving recklessly and just their own pleasure and enjoyment above the lives of their grandparents. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. It seems to me lots of young people take strength and love from their extended families. And it seems like, but they still are young people. You know, they behave as children and young people do, which is exactly as it should be and exactly what's expected. But then to be berated for doing that, to be blamed as virus spreaders. And I think this really became obvious to me when you saw some of the things that were statements that were coming from Mary Bowstead, the head of the National Education Union, where I think this was probably about April, beginning of May time, where she was talking quite seriously about proposals to disinfect children at the school gates. And you just, as a metaphor for the way children are seen as dirty, infected, I just thought this is just really, really horrible.
Well, I totally agree with you, Joanna. I think the rhetoric's completely wrong, but I think it goes worse than that. I think possibly even the rationale is wrong. So if you move ahead to sort of university age kids, you know, young adults, the don't kill your granny narrative and criticizing people for wanting to meet and enjoy their lives, I think the whole policy is wrong, actually. And if you do a little bit of thinking about it, there's a very, very good case, a rational case, for allowing students to get on with their lives in universities as normal, because the risk to them is quite minimal, and to allow the virus to pass through naturally the university population. And I would ask, just a contrary to the government's stop-go panicking and haphazard policy, I would ask you, would we be in a better place if the virus passed through most universities naturally throughout the first term and a half, and we get to, you know, March and April next year, where we've got a lot of population immunity in the student population? Personally, I think that's the more rational approach. What do you think?
Absolutely, I agree with you 100%. And this is a subject very close to my heart. I have my two eldest children are at university. My middle son I dropped off at Glasgow University about 3-4 weeks ago now, and he's been in a semi-permanent state of lockdown in his halls of residence ever since. Online learning, police and security guards patrolling outside his hall of residence. And he put it to me that it was completely the wrong way round, that young people were being effectively locked up, particularly in Scotland, told they couldn't even meet, go to the pub even with people from their same household. They were being locked up, presumably, so that people over the age of 60 and 70 who were more at risk could go to the pub and mix with people in public. And it seems absolutely ludicrous.
It seems, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of contradictions in government policy. That's one of them, yes. They're currently shielding the healthy and the unlikely to be ill, and allowing, perhaps not shielding the genuinely vulnerable to the extent they should. I mean, it's very difficult, because as I say, I didn't criticize the government early on very much. but I genuinely think they're missing the costs of the aggregate costs of what they're doing, and haphazard policy, stop-go policy doesn't work anywhere because the public don't know where they are. I mean, to go from, we've missed the summer out actually, Joanna, where we went from 7-week lockdown, full draconian lockdown, the like of which people our age would not have ever understood that it could be the case. I remember when Wuhan was being locked down, and we found that out in the first 2 months of this year. You thought, well, it could never happen here, and yet it did, and it shows you how fragile liberty is. Even in a place like Britain with very high embedded rights, they're removed very, very quickly if we're not careful. But the contradictory nature has astounded me. So we go from full lockdown to go where they're literally bribing the public to go to eat out at restaurants. What did you make of that policy in the summer?
Well, I'd be lying if I said I didn't take advantage of it personally. I certainly did lots of eating out to helping out, but I think you're absolutely right again on the whole stop-start nature of this and the confusing messages, and we don't know what we're supposed to be doing from one moment to the next. I think even worse than the eat out, help out has been the go to work, don't go to work message that changed within the space of a week, obviously only for people who have the luxury to be office-based workers who have the privilege, if you like, of being able to work from home. But yeah, those messages have been completely contradictory, and it just seems totally pointless. But I think on the point you're making about lockdown being completely unprecedented, obviously we can't tell yet, but I do wonder sometimes what the psychological impact of this is going to be on the nation and the population as a whole, because it does seem like, again, in relation to schools, but in relation to life more broadly, everything that we took for granted for decades, for our entire lives, the freedom to walk outside of our own front door as many times a day as we want to, the freedom to be able to get on a bus, to go somewhere, to get on a train, to travel, to go and sit in a friend's house and have a cup of coffee. These are not huge liberties that I'm talking about, but just small everyday freedoms that we completely take for granted. When all of those went, it's like having a rug pulled from underneath your feet. And I think it creates a kind of national insecurity where you think, if the government can do this once, why can't we can't take these things for granted again? It makes you question everything.
I agree also. I think one of the things that it did early on was remove a free society, a truly free people has realize that you enjoy a sort of ambiguity with rules. I mean, I'm not in favor of people breaking rules for the hell of it or anything, but you put a piece on Spiked about the rise in domestic violence. This was obviously, certainly in reports and helplines and so on, this was happening. And you made the point that actually the person taking the second walk in a day might be necessary. And as a society, we might have to accept the fact that a little bit of tolerance here and there. I mean, I really dislike the snooping thing. I think that's it brings out the worst in people. For society to function, you've got to allow people to make their own decisions.
I think you're absolutely right. And I guess I've always been a very law-abiding person, and certainly not somebody who's advocated breaking the law. But I think another thing that's really bad about the current situation that we find ourselves in is I think it actually makes liars and lawbreakers of all of us, because in order to survive, in order to live, we have to find ways to work around the law, and particularly around the ever-changing nature of the law. And I can honestly say, hand on heart, everybody who I know broke those lockdown rules in one way or another, whether it was going for a walk in the park with a friend when it was the main lockdown period, whether it was inviting a friend into your garden to sit and have a cup of coffee with, again, when we weren't supposed to do that. But I think everybody I know was incredibly sensible, very cautious, but at the same time, you do what you need to do in order to survive and stay sane. And yet you end up then entering into this peculiar relationship with the law and the rules, where you end up becoming a lawbreaker, even if that's not how you want to live your life.
It's been so difficult anyway. I mean, just the constant change of the rules, as you know, where I'm speaking from the northeast in Northumberland, we're under, semi-lockdown now. I can't go to a friend's house for a cup of tea. And I chair a community council up here, and I'm constantly on to the council clerk to say what's the situation now, because we have play parks and facilities and parish hall and and libraries and things and toilets which we've had to. My attitude all along has been to open up as quickly as we're allowed to under the rules, but it's genuinely been difficult for us to negotiate it. And we're advised by the government anyway, but it changes so often, it's been very difficult. Can I just move on? One thing that's intrigued me from the start and has worried me is that the sense I've got, and I think I'm right, that the government, we know we live in a political world. We're not daft, but I think a lot of policy's been driven by political salience rather than science. So we're saying, follow the science. Well, a new disease, you can't be an expert in a new disease for a start, and the virologists and the others disagreed anyway. But take masks, for instance. There's about 30 years of evidence on masks which are fairly skeptical about their efficacy. And the WHO were not keen on masks, until sort of February, March. Government wasn't very keen on masks. And then suddenly, when we get to the summer, then we've got to wear masks. And I'll just put it to you, my theory on this is that they know that the efficacy isn't much, but they just felt we're going to get hammered by the press if we don't do this. What do you make of that?
I think you're right, but I think there's also possibly a little bit more to it as well. So masks came in, if I remember rightly, around the same time that shops began to open. And I think somebody in government seemed to come up with the idea that if we all wore masks, it would create a feeling of safety and reassurance and make people feel more comfortable going out into shops. So even if this didn't have a huge medical benefit in terms of suppressing the virus, it would serve a psychological purpose, either in making us more careful and have a constant reminder on our faces of the need to be careful, and at the same time act as a reassurance to people who are nervous about going out. But I think in that and in so many other ways, what the past couple of months have really shown to me is just how utterly useless and out of touch the government are at reading public opinion, because going to the shops and seeing everyone wearing masks is not remotely reassuring. It has completely the opposite impact. It makes you nervous, and it turns shopping into the most horrible experience, where you run in, grab what you want, or I do anyway, and run back out again in order to be able to breathe once more.
Joanna, for me, shopping always has been the most horrible experience. So I'm not, yeah. But no, I agree with you. When you see the clips of Stockholm and you see people, business as usual, in inverted commas, that certainly it's a less fear-based, panic-based approach. And I think it's strange. I just think that a lot of it is so obviously geared to what Robert Peston or some BBC person will ask them at a press conference. They'll say, well, you should, had you done this, then, and you can see it. I mean, I'm not saying, I'm not a utopian. I know we live in a political world, but it's quite obvious to me that that's happened. Another thing that's really interesting, and I wrote a piece for Con Woman the other day about the lack of opposition. So this is really intriguing. So at every stage, literally every stage, the government announces a measure, and then Starmer and all three of them, the SNP, the Lib Dems, such as they exist, and the Labour Party, try and just gold plate it a little bit. So they'll say, okay, well, you're going to do this, but you're not doing enough. So it's actually been the opposite. The plus V, minus V of what they've done has been amplified by the opposition. So we haven't really had an opposition. Why Why is that the case? It's bizarre to me.
No, I think you're right, and I think that's the tragedy, and it's really why we find ourselves where we are today. I mean, I don't know is the easy answer as to why this is. I think there are probably lots of explanations, but I think one thing that strikes me is right from the very, very beginning, the narrative was set. Again, I think we've already touched upon that. If you in any way challenged what the government was doing, then you were right-wing, ruthless, individualistic, horrible person who, and the kind of killer argument was that you were putting money, essentially, you were putting the economy over lives. And if you were a nice person, you wouldn't do that. If you were a good person, you'd want to save lives rather than worrying about the economy and rather than worrying about individual liberty. Now, I think that narrative was put so firmly in place, but I think it's so false and so damaging. I think it's completely untrue, that polarization between economy on the one hand and saving lives on the other hand. I mean, I'm not the first person to say this, lots of people have said it before, but it's a completely false polarity. We actually need an economy to keep people in work, not to provide a living for people. That's essential for people's mental health. It's actually essential for people's physical health to have enough money to pay for food for their families and to heat their houses and not to go to bed at night worrying about keeping the roof over their heads. We need taxpayers to put money into the NHS to save hospitals, to fund cancer treatments. All of these things are cyclical. But to me as well, I think the anti-lockdown people were caricatured as being horrible individualists, as opposed to the kind of nice communitarian-minded pro-lockdown people. And again, I think that's an entirely false, really horribly false position, because it seems to me like it's very easy to be pro-lockdown if you have a lovely house, you can afford regular food deliveries, you have an office area in your house to make working from home nice and easy, you have the luxury of a parent who doesn't work, perhaps, who's able to look after the children during the day. All of those things, I think, made lockdown a very, very individualized experience. And to argue for more lockdown is to argue for that individualistic, we want to retreat into our own houses, essentially. We don't want to be part of a broader community looking to tackle this problem together. We want to go into our own house. Maybe we'll come out for 5 minutes on a Thursday evening and bang a saucepan to show solidarity for the NHS. But we want to order our own food delivery. We want to look after our own children, and we want to stay inside our own house. But I think that mischaracterization of lockdown skeptics as these cruel individualists who thought only about money and about their own personal freedoms, I think really put paid to any opposition.
Yeah, I think you put that really well, and perhaps we can investigate this a little bit further, because as you say, it was characterized as a sort of libertarian thing. I mean, the SDP is not a famously libertarian party. We're liberal, but we're not liberals, and our objection to it was firmly communitarian, because to me, the lockdown, as I say, we've been through that, but it was probably necessary at the time. I can see why they did it, but it delayed, it didn't solve the pandemic. That's the first thing. The real error that's been made, and this will come out one day, the real error they've made is that they've failed to properly account for the costs, human costs, and there are financial costs, which would be human costs anyway, the human costs of the lockdown. They failed to calculate that other side of the balance sheet, or the cost benefit, if you like. They've just completely failed to do that. They've failed to account for it, and they've failed to take responsibility for it. So they're not, they're literally blind to all of the other consequences of what they're doing, trundling on, focusing on this single issue. And I don't think that's very communitarian. And I'm absolutely convinced that the lockdown itself, the net effect, will probably be saving no lives at all, probably cost lives. And this is the killer fact, and it's going to cost the country about £1 trillion, which will have an effect on a whole generation of people. So I think in the history of mega mistakes in government, we're witnessing one. We're the only party that stood up against it pretty much, although we're very small. And it's truly bizarre, but intellectually, I won't have it. I mean, the libertarian case for individual freedom is very strong and very important, but it wasn't the prime reason we objected to.
No, and I mean, it was your the SDP statement in relation to lockdown that made me sign up and become a member of the SDP. And I share lots of your concerns. I actually think lockdown has ripped the heart out of communities up and down the country. And just to come back to what we were talking about a few moments ago in relation to masks in shops, I mean, you know, you and I can both laugh and perhaps say that we, didn't really enjoy shopping that much anyway. But for some people, thinking particularly perhaps older women who live alone, actually those conversations and smiling at people in shops might be one of the few forms of social interaction that they have with other people each day. The same with pubs. You know, everybody could come up with various things that they don't really do very much themselves and think, oh, well, that's all right. But again, perhaps for people who live alone, the local pub might be the one place where you go and you're actually meeting with other people, and it might be, you know, the only conversation that you're having. It's your link to people who live near you, your link into society, your link with the community. Now, I think we're already seeing up and down Britain pubs and shops closing, and we can put a price on that. We can put a price on it in terms of the job losses, in terms of the revenue not generated. But I think above and beyond those things, the social cost, the loss to the community of jobs and of pubs and shops closing, again, just puts us all back into our homes on our own. Yes, we can order our shopping online. Yes, I can go to a supermarket and buy some beer if I want some beer. But actually, the site of social interaction that takes place within shops and pubs and cafes and on street corners, we're losing all of that, and that's tragic for the fabric of society.
It is. It's vital. I mean, you know, these are the consequences. When it started, we set up just here as a community a volunteer network, which myself and a few other people organised, and we ran prescriptions, and because a lot of people that were older couldn't get out actually. And the ones that I was running and helping, quite a few people were saying, "Look, where do I go from here? You know, I can't. Well, you know, I'm 80, haven't got maybe many years left, and we face this, and I'm locked here, and you're running these prescriptions for me." But it's a terrible situation. I mean, I think we're forgetting a lot of things, and I think that's been the major criticism, and I think it will come out. I don't think it's going to be easy for government to admit the mistakes, partly because the mistakes have been made collectively across the Western world particularly, but we'll see. To finish, I wonder whether we could try and see some silver linings in what has been an appalling situation. Are there any that you can see?
Well, I think exactly what you just described in terms of people getting together, particularly in the very, very early stages of lockdown. So suddenly I was shopping for my next door neighbour and ended up speaking to my next door neighbour who fell into one of the vulnerable categories over the garden fence. Probably more in the past 2 years than I have done, past 2 months, sorry, than I had done in the previous 10 years, I'm embarrassed to admit. And that sense of communities pulling together and rallying round, shopping for people, picking up prescriptions for people, I think that was a really nice thing that happened. My worry is that the government, it's almost, I wouldn't say intentionally, but it's almost as if we've been told now not to do those things. It almost feels like, or this has gone on for so long, or particularly I'm thinking of places in the north. Most of my family still are around Middlesbrough area and Yorkshire, and this particular ruling about not being able to go into someone's house, I think that risks breaking down some of these positive relationships and new relationships and that kind of generosity of spirit. I think there's a huge difference between knocking on someone's door and here's your shopping and stopping and having a chat with them, and putting down the bag of shopping and then running to the other end of the path because you're nervous about being caught with 6 people, or, you know, interacting with a neighbour when you're not allowed to do so. And I think there were some really positive things at first. And like I said, my fear is that the more we get this hyper-regulation, the more even those positive things become difficult to enact.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I think, you know, in a way it's made people realise when you lose something, you know, it's like you don't appreciate the water until the well's dry. I think there's a lot of that. I think, you know, certainly I won't take Friday nights in the pub for granted. Again, I suppose we did. I mean, I think there are some broader silver linings. I'm just trying to finish positively because I think it's important. I think for us, I think the pandemic revealed that indifference to where things are made, which is all this sort of trade liberal, you know, liberalism that you've had 30 years of, I think that's been ruthlessly exposed. I think it matters where things are made. I think we need to get more domestic resilience in that and make a few things here again, even if they cost more. I think it's brought into focus that some of the stuff that was made in the Far East in a certain large state is pretty close to slave labor in many situations, and we shouldn't be indifferent about that. And I think another silver lining possibly is a reorientation in the universities, although that may be a little bit brutal. And I genuinely, my wife works at the university here in Newcastle, and I'm not wanting to sort of wish ill onto anyone, but there is a necessary reckoning in the universities. I think you've had grade inflation, as you've written about, grade inflation, you know, kids not getting good contact hours and so on. I think maybe there's a reckoning, and maybe we get less university and more vocational and training, which I think in 5 years' time will be the case. And I think that's possibly a silver lining. Just finally, the other one I think is that, I mean, it's been necessary to reorientate sort of culturally what we're about. And I think the realization that it's not all about money is something that younger people are sort of facing very sharply now. And I think maybe I'm hoping that some of them will start families and, you know, just reorientate their lives to other things. You know, I mean, I know David Goodhart's got the new book out about, you know, vocation and so on. I think that may be a positive thing. So I think maybe there will be some positive things, and I hope so. But, you know, do you agree?
I think one thing that's been true throughout the past few months is that a lot of problems that were already underlying our society have been exposed and made very starkly apparent in such a way that might make them more difficult to ignore. So for me, I guess housing would be one particular issue around that. I think all the Zoom calling, I was speaking to somebody the other day who works for a multinational accountancy firm, and they were telling me that what's very obvious is that the kind of managers, the senior managers, when they Zoom in from their very, very large houses, their huge conservatories overlooking with kind of garden-like fields in the background, compared to the not even junior members of staff, but just the regular members of staff who are either sat in bedrooms or in very, very cramped offices. The problems that we have with things like housing, with an unbalanced economy, have been made very starkly apparent, it seems to me, over the past few months. And if we can go anyway to trying to solve those problems, I think that would be good.
I totally agree with you. It's a major, I mean, it's been a preoccupation. People accuse me of going on about two things in particular: railway nationalisation and the need to build some social housing on a decent scale. And the state has to get back into this. Unfortunately, the current proposal the Tories have are predictable market-based nonsense. You just have to do some heavy lifting if you want to build some housing, I'm afraid. And you also have to look at immigration as well. Two things they won't do, unfortunately, but I certainly agree with you. Listen, right, it's been a pleasure, and I'd just like to thank you for joining the party. It meant a lot to us when we heard about it. We never, ever pressurize people, and I just don't think you can do that. But you know, it's wonderful to get someone like you to join. It's fantastic. Thanks very much. I know you have a school run to do, and I have a whippet to walk. Thanks very much. It's been a pleasure. And take care, Joanna. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.